ready to go. They've got something fun planned for you. When I was a kid, things were quite a bit different than they are now. Kids had a lot more freedom, kind of come and go and do things. For instance, this is just one example I was thinking of this week. I remember my mom and dad taking me trick-or-treating maybe once or twice when I was like a toddler, and then it was like, yeah, go ahead. And so after that, I was pretty much on my own. And on Beggar's Night, I can remember me and my best friend, for the longest time, we would literally sprint from house to house. There was no way an adult could have ever kept up with us. And we didn't take just a little bag or a little plastic pumpkin for our loot. We took oversized pillowcases, and we filled them up. And there was basically just one rule. My mom and dad said, here's the rule. If the porch light is off, that means you go to the next house. They're not open for business. If the porch light is on, you're good to go. That was the one rule we followed. To this day, when I see someone's porch light on, I see it as a sign of friendliness and welcome. A few years ago, I even put automatic timers on my outdoor lights so that they would turn on every night at sunset. So I didn't have to think about it because I want my house to look welcoming too. So they turn on at sunset and they turn off again at 11 o'clock every night. I'm not saying people aren't welcome at my house or at my door after 11 p.m., but I'm also not trying to encourage it either. That's why the lights go off. Motel 6 and their spokesperson, Tom Bodette, came up with that brilliant slogan, we'll leave the light on for you. And they mean it. Their doors are open 24/7. That's their business. And I think the reason those advertisements have been so successful and have stuck in our heads all these years is because seeing that light on, seeing that light in the window like we have here behind us, just makes sense to us, right? We get it. And I think that's why the Bible begins with light and dark, with the juxtaposition of night and day, light and dark. In the beginning, there was nothing but darkness and chaos. Genesis tells us the very first thing God did was say, let there be light. And there was. God turned on the light and the darkness fled. God turned on the porch light and made it possible for the rest of creation to come into being. The Gospel of John begins in a very similar way by pointing back to that first light and connecting it with the gift of Jesus. So in the opening verses of John, we read this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. That image of light and dark comes up again in John's gospel over and over again. It's kind of a theme. So, for instance, this is one really great example of that. Right after one of the most memorized verses in the New Testament, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only son. Okay? A verse or two after that, John continues, and this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. Now you'd think choosing light over dark would be an easy choice. But sometimes the darkness can feel like safety and protection. In the darkness, people can hide. We can hide. In the light, things are exposed, things we might not want other people to see. It's why we have something called sunshine laws in our country. Going clear back to the beginning. Sunshine laws require government agencies and certain businesses to be transparent and disclose their activities in public. Back in the late 1800s, a U.S. Supreme Court justice by the name of Louis Brandeis said, sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. And it is. As John said, sometimes people choose darkness over light because their deeds are evil, and they'd rather no one know about it. It makes sense. But I think there are other reasons people choose the dark. It doesn't have anything to do with evil. It has more to do with hopelessness and despair. For instance, sometimes when people suffer, when people grieve, they give up on the light. That idea of hope or joy or peace, really of any kind, seems so far off that at some point they just begin to believe that light itself is an illusion, and that there really is nothing but darkness. Years ago, I did a funeral for a woman who'd been bright and full of life. Her husband of many years was devastated by her death, and which often happens. And I can remember a few weeks after her funeral, I got a call from their grown children. And they said that their dad was depressed. And they wanted to know if I'd go visit him. And I still remember the day I went to his house. Beautiful home, beautiful neighborhood. And it was one of those perfect spring days that we sometimes get in April or May. And you know the kind of day I'm talking about. Everything was green and lush. We'd had rain. The sun was shining. It was maybe 70 degrees. The air was clear. The birds were singing. I walked up to the house, and there were no signs of life. I rang the doorbell, stood there a long time. Finally, he answered the door. Obviously, been sleeping, looked disheveled. And once I got inside, it was like going into a cave or even a grave. The lights were out. The shades were drawn. He was living in deep darkness in every way. One of my biggest challenges as a pastor has always been helping people who've fallen into despair. And the reason I say that is because it's easy to understand why people do that, right? It's why they might choose the darkness. Through the years, I've worked with families who've lost children to tragic accidents or suicide. I've had friends and church members who've suffered through terrible chronic pain that just won't go away. One of my first experiences in pastoral ministry, right out of seminary, I was in my mid-20s, started a group very similar to the gathering that we have here at this church, and there was a young woman and her husband that were a part of that group. She was just a few years older than me, so late 20s, early 30s, and she was diagnosed with lymphoma. And she never got better. She was a ballet dancer. She was the life of the party everywhere she ever went. She and her husband were not only church members, they became dear friends. She was a beautiful, bright light, and I watched her life slowly ebb away. It was hard for her and for everyone who loved her, and everyone did. When someone is suffering or grieving or even dying, the last thing they want to hear or need to hear is that everything's going to be okay. We're tempted to say that. I know I am. I want to put a good face on everything. Everything's going to be okay. But we know not everything is going to be okay. In fact, things might get worse. And acknowledging that is okay. Pretending that darkness doesn't exist doesn't offer comfort to anyone. It's not what anybody needs or wants to hear. And the Bible doesn't ask us to do that either. The Bible never says that darkness is going to go away completely, at least not in the world as we know it now. There will come a time when the darkness will go away. I think we're going to talk about that next week. The Bible says this, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not and will not overcome it. That's what the Bible says. And that's where our hope lies. That even in the midst of a vast and overpowering darkness, the light still shines. On Christmas Eve, we read one of the earliest prophecies in the Old Testament about the coming of a Messiah, the hope of a Messiah. It's the verse in Isaiah that describes how the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. One of my favorite verses. Now, the opening verses of that chapter 9 of Isaiah, talks about the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, if you know anything about your Old Testament or a little bit your Old Testament, you may remember that those were the names of two of Jacob's 12 sons, whose tribes settled in the Holy Lands, and Zebulun and Naphtali settled in the northernmost part of the Holy Lands, which is also called Galilee. So that was the part of Israel that first came under attack by the Assyrian Empire, by the Assyrian army, about 700 years before the birth of Jesus. It was the place Israel as a nation experienced its first real military defeat and national humiliation. And they never forgot that. In Galilee, darkness descended on the people of Israel in a very real and profound way. But as Isaiah prophesied, it would also be in Galilee that God's light would one day shine the brightest. That's the prophecy, which we read in Isaiah 9. But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. One of the greatest lessons we learn from the people of Israel is to look for the light, even in what might seem like the darkest night. And we see example after example of that in Israel's history, throughout their history. For instance, when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, things looked bleak. I mean, really bleak. Even when they escaped, right? They found themselves between the Red Sea on one side and the entire Egyptian army on the other. Over and over again, we see times when it appeared as if Israel would be completely and utterly destroyed. Even secular history confirms the fact that Israel really did suffer at the hands of powerful empires. And they were just a small throwaway nation at that point, right? The Assyrians came through, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. The darkness that surrounded Israel wasn't imaginary. It was real. But so was their hope. So was their faith. They waited on the Lord. They looked for a Messiah. And as Isaiah prophesied, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. That light shined for the first time in Bethlehem. But it shined even brighter 30 years later in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, in Galilee of the nations, because it was there in a place marked by trauma and humiliation that Jesus began his ministry, fulfilling that prophecy. Jesus was the light that shined in the darkness. And in John 8:12, our text for today, just one verse long, he confirmed what those who followed him already knew. It says there, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. That's the promise of Jesus. The darkness is still there, but now there's light. We no longer have to navigate in the dark by ourselves. We don't have to stumble around hoping we might accidentally, by trial and error, find the right way. Jesus will light the way for us, step by step. Alistair Begg, the pastor of Parkside Church in Cleveland, Ohio, put it like this. I thought this was a great summary of this idea. He writes, the point is very clear. If men and women are to know real life, they must come to the light. Into the darkness of their lives, Jesus comes with truth. To the darkness of ignorance, Jesus is their wisdom. The darkness of their impurity is to be flooded with the light of his holiness. The darkness of their grief and loss overtaken by the light of his joy. And the darkness of physical and spiritual death exchanged for the reality of eternal light and life. Of course, there are alternatives to walking in the light. And unfortunately, I think many of us often try those first, unsuccessfully. I've come to the believe that one of the primary reasons for the epidemic of drug addiction and alcoholism in our world is not because people want to party and celebrate. I mean, that's, I think, how it's projected sometimes. That's not what it's about. I think it's because people will do just about anything they can to escape their personal darkness and despair. That's why they seek that stuff out. So they crawl into a bottle or a pipe or a pill that promises to kill the pain. And for an hour or two, it works, or at least it seems like it works. And they escape that. And I've seen it 100 times. It's why I refuse now to talk about spiritual things with people who are high. I won't do it. Not anymore. Because I know what comes next. Drugs and alcohol offer the illusion of light and peace. And it seems like that's what, where they're at. But it isn't. Because when the bottom falls out, which it always does, that darkness looms even bigger and scarier than it did before. And it's a vicious cycle. I know some of you experienced that before. But there's a way out. That's the good news. We don't have to settle for anything less than the real thing. Like many of you, one of my go-to memory verses is the 23rd Psalm. I don't know how often, every week that I pray that psalm, and it brings me great comfort. And one of my favorite lines is right smack in the middle of that psalm where it says, "Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death," the scariest, darkest place you can imagine, "I fear no evil, for you are with me." I can't count the number of times I've repeated those words at the bedsides of saints whose physical lives, whose mortal lives were coming to an end. There is comfort in those words and power in those words, because no matter how scary things might be, Jesus is the good shepherd who walks with us, even in the valley of the shadow of death. Indeed, Jesus is the one who defeated sin and death and darkness. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light." In Jesus, God said, "I'll leave the light on for you." Believe that. Trust in that. And you'll never walk in darkness again.